What is the difference between freedom and liberation? And what is your relationship to liberation now? That's the question. Yes, I love Shauna Murray Brown's language here. Freedom is individual, liberation is collective. Freedom is thought to be a fundamental human right. Historically, the word has been used in relationship to autonomy and independence. In religious context, it's usually related to freedom from religious persecution. Politically, the right to know and be involved in what your government is doing and to be able to have a public opinion about your government, meaning that you can speak to that opinion out loud without risking a consequence from your government. Economically, freedom is often about your right to pursue guap by various means, fair trade and whatnot. And of course, individually, relating to the rights of individuals to design our lives and live them in relative peace. But is freedom different from liberation, though? The word liberation is generally used in response to oppression, and is usually relating to a group, not a specific person, but more so the situation or the circumstance under which the freedom of that individual was taken. So even though we might call for the liberation of a political prisoner, the liberation part refers to the politics of their imprisonment, the thing that resulted in them losing their freedom. It's a response to oppression in that political sense. And so enslavement is historically what the term liberation looks to repair or change. And then over time, liberation, the term related to the ongoing fights for civil rights for various groups, Black folks, Native Indigenous folks, women, LGBTQ plus folk, differently abled people, and young people, an oppressed class that we often dismiss, both out there in society and right in here in our own homes and psyches. And more recently, liberation is also used in relationship to a person's individual efforts to get free from oppression that shows up in the forms of psychological or spiritual shackles. My book talks about liberation and healing work, and my work now, on the other side of my 8-year focus on unschooling, is about where my liberation work is guiding me to now. This is, in a lot of ways, a remix of a talk that I did at the Reimagine Learning Center as part of a conference with Growing Minds. My people. So I talked about it here in this space, and now I wanted to live here too with you, updated for not only the times, but my perspective on freedom and liberation and what they've been informed by and where I am with them now. Freedom is an absolute thing. One is either free or not. Very little gray area there. What freedom is firm, but how we approach it is not. Our approach can be a very tricky thing. Sometimes freedom is something we protect and preserve. Other times it's something we provide and design. And when we are parents or other forms of caregivers, freedom work can get even more tricky, even harder to discern, partially because in a freedom-centered, liberation-minded approach to parenting and caregiving, so much of the work is discerning between the times that we provide freedom and the times where we simply need to preserve it. Because sometimes liberation is not about providing or designing anything, but about backing away. Not to neglect or ignore, but backing away so as not to get in the way of or become an obstacle for something that is doing just fine. It already is. Most people watching this, I think it's safe to assume, were born free. If you were not, and perhaps you had a child, hopefully that child was born free. So to continue what already is, to preserve a freedom that is from birth, can often look a lot like backing away, like allowing what already is to be as it is, to mind your business, basically. So when we are born, even as dependent as we are on older humans, we're still essentially born free. We still start with freedom. But as we grow from infancy over into our walking and talking years, our history of freedom becomes compromised by expressions of love, by language, by lesson plans, by the lengths to which our loved ones will go in efforts to design our futures. As adults, we tend to look right past who a child is in a moment over to who they might become. And when we, who are adults now, were children, we most likely were overlooked in favor of our potential, in favor of who we might could end up being if we just listen to whoever trying to tell us what to do. And as that child grows into adolescence, adults still look past who that young person is, either back to the faults that they've always had, or again, over to who they might just could become, the potential. So we trade in the present and to some extent the past for the idea of a well-designed future. We look ahead at the future that could be, and we discount that person's history of freedom. And our histories are important. For some of us, they inform our identity and help us to define ourselves outside of the pressures and gazes of parents and school and society. Personally, as an island-born diasporic African woman, I can safely suppose a few things about my own history. And it's a huge part of how I design and live out my own liberation. Being born in Jamaica, it's most likely that my ancestors were West Africans, enslaved and brought to the Caribbean to work land and to make more people who would also work land. My ancestors were likely brought in by the Spanish or the Portuguese in the 1500s or the British in the late 1600s. My West African dwelling ancestors were likely born free, then later became enslaved. So for them, freedom warped from something to protect and preserve to something to design and then fight to maintain. And in their approach to liberation, much of the work must have been about strategy and sacrifice, pain and persistence, and even acquiescence and acceptance to some extent. A constant struggle to reclaim their power and to design methods for freedom gaining that were meant to resist and to topple, to tear down the system that stood tall and thick and wide. For my ancestors who had to design their path to liberation, there first had to be resistance, the first step in their journey to reclamation. Resistance looked like learning to read, poisoning slave owners, organizing escapes, running like hell at the onset of unplanned opportunity, sacrificing the lives of some for the freedom of others. They needed to actively resist enslavement by creating situations that would first liberate them from their prisons to help them reclaim their freedom, and then later, if they were fortunate, help them maintain the freedom they designed and pursued. That powerful pattern, resistance, rebellion, and reclamation, is part of what I draw on today as I practice ownership of self, leadership of self, personal leadership. And of course, my need for and my right and approach to liberation has a very different design than that of my ancestors and the people who fought alongside them. Their liberation journeys were by necessity brutal, designed not to preserve, but to physically move people and to disrupt the social norms with rebellion and escape tactics in big, brutal ways like battle, and quieter, powerful ways like learning how to read and forging freedom papers. But our liberation journey today, if we are free, as in not incarcerated, our journey today is mostly about maintaining something that we were born with. It's about a knowledge of self and a support of confident autonomy in ourselves and in young people that stops us from click-locking ourselves and children into coercive, oppressive, toxic spaces like the pervasive educational model that reduces personhood to student and later to worker or employee or entrepreneur who is also enslaved to their work. because that's real too. If you're watching a video with the word liberation in the title, maybe a big part of your liberation journey might have been about rejecting the option of performing a life so that you can participate authentically in your own life design. Many of us who click on videos with words like liberation in the title are motivated to de-school ourselves. Partly so that our children, if we have them, don't need to design their own liberation or perform their lives. Instead, they can maintain and expand on the liberation that we help to preserve through our support and through the village that we help to build around us. So back home, there's this saying related to efforting and like life design. And it's very telling in that it speaks to the cultural assumptions and the resulting agreements that help to determine and shape our society's approach to personal leadership. So in Jamaican patois, it's "was sweet nanny go tago running belly." And my attempt to translate that would be, what tastes good to the goat is also going to give his ass diarrhea. What sweet nanny goat go running belly, right? We say running belly for diarrhea. Kind of gross. Yeah. Essentially, it's saying what feels good is not good. It's warning us not to pursue what feels good over what we know we need to do. Because success, real success, could not possibly come from doing the things we love, the things that feel good. Instead, it comes from leaning in, hustling, doing the hard work that does not feel good, but will yield a good result. The message is that if it feels good to you, it don't good for you. That's basically it. The message is that if you are feeling happy and engaged, you'll just feel good in the moment. And eventually, the pursuit of that good feeling will be shit. It's about grinning and bearing it. Work hard. The reward comes later. The joy comes later when you earn it. And in America, that hustle hard mentality also applies. Freedom, we are taught from childhood, is something you earn, not something you're born with. And so if this is the lens of freedom for us, then what that says is that we are free to save ourselves and our loved ones from hurting bellies, from childish things like the desire to feel good and to follow your curiosities down some haphazard road. Instead, what you do is you choose from charted courses, right? Courses that were proven by those who were savvy enough not to let the sweetness run their bellies. Then, only then will you win at adulting. And then you'll be free to do with your life whatever it is that you want. And this is the messaging, is still the messaging, mostly. So that example of a cultural assumption and agreement most certainly informs our approach to raising humans, and it affected how we were raised, and it affects all of our stories about our own entitlement to joy. As humans, if we are born free, and if we are in spaces where the adults around us are free to raise their children how they choose, because that is not the case everywhere for everybody, but if you were born free, then you are among the lucky ones who were allowed a few years of the feel-good life. And then though, once you can like walk and talk, and once our awareness of ourselves and our surroundings is recognizable by the adults in charge of us, it is time to get weaned from that good life. Whatever is feeling good, Now we move over to what is necessary, which happens somewhere around age 6 or 7 in the form of schooling. If we don't, the syrup of the sweet life will spoil us and ruin perfectly good human potential. And as we approach that critical stage where we must take the window of opportunity to escape the fate of the nanny goat, this is where we shift from the freedom into which we were born over to a liberation we now feel we must earn. Because now our freedom is no longer attached to personhood. It is no longer ours. Now it is subjected to a design that is hella informed by these cultural assumptions and reinforced by various industrial complexes. We become food for these different industrial complexes when we morph from natural life learner to performance artist, also known as student. And when we morph into student, we click lock, boom, right into these complexes and pursue diplomas and degrees and certificates, all words for freedom papers, which hold the same value today as they did when they were used with enslaved people. Permission to be seen in public spaces. Seen might mean something different now than it did back then, but same energy. We lock into this illusion that we are born enslaved by ignorance and that the right we have is actually the right to earn our liberation by replacing this pursuit of feel good, as in a meaningful life as defined by you, replacing that foolishness with schoolishness, also known as the educational industrial complex. This way, this agreement, this social norm tells us that we earn liberation when we race to the top. And we race to the top by performing well. So we grow up believing that our performance determines our power and that our scores are somehow inextricably linked to our sovereignty. But performance is not personhood. A performance is not who I am, it's what I did. As a little girl, when a grown-up asked me how I was or how I was doing in school, I knew as early as I can remember that they were not asking me about me, Akila. They were asking me about the performance of the student named Akila. And I knew how to play student, how to play school, get good at playing school, and confined my actual curiosities. As children, we are often reduced to students, and that status causes adults to view us through the lens of our ability to adapt, to smooth out edges, and perform in the system that we're required to be part of and to perform in. But the thing is, we are not required to be part of it. We are not required to perform in it. And your freedom, as well as your role in collective liberation, depends on you realizing that. We are not required to be part of the systems that oppress us. Write it down. Now, the systems may require our participation in terms of legally, but it does not require us to stop asking questions, to design our lives outside of the confines of how we are socialized. It doesn't always require us, now, depending on where you live and also how many resources you have, to surrender to antiquated, inhumane models of education disguised as institutions of learning. We are institutions of learning. It does not require us to embrace this hyper-individualism at the cost of community, which is what so many of us actually need, but have very little practice being engaged with in healthy ways. Because schoolishness tells us we got to make it on our own, stand out, be exceptional, and just embrace that the haters gonna hate. If you keep on thinking that, it's going to be to the detriment of your mental health and at the expense of so many logistical and emotional needs that healthy, intentional community care can solve. So for many of us, we see the problems with school and with the fake assness, the performative things in community, lack of knowledge of self, lack of good resources to support our mental and physical health consistently. We see those issues, but we also need to remember that it's not enough to just see them and talk about them. We also need to know and trust that we can also contribute to the design of liberation where design is needed. When we see ourselves as seekers of our own joy and meaning and supporters of children in their own journeys to do the very same thing. When we put our focus on identifying our personal ideas about freedom and our roles in collective liberation, we build real egalitarian relationships with people, whether they 5, 15, 55, or 95. And that is what I started to really like understand and then zoom in on over the last 8 years while I was really focused on unschooling. And it's through that, because of that, that I can speak from where I am now and the skills that I gained from that journey. And one of the most important skills, let me tell you, is a skill that I learned not just in the context of being like people's mama or people's facilitator or guide, but also personally, like for myself and as part of community. One of the most important skills I learned is how to let be what already is, how to let be what already is in terms of freedom over people and processes that I have power over. To let be what already is when it is not in the way of something for me. That is a skill. It's a community skill. It's also very much a personal leadership skill that, like all skills, affect community. I learned to trust what freedom looked like for the oppressed class that is young people, and let that trust inform my own individual and communal practices of care and attention and love. For my family, it looks like brilliant innovation, just like a level of creative expression that is just unblocked. It looked like relearning how to play as an adult with like bills and things. Knowing how to play is a flex. Okay. It also looked so much like mindfulness in entrepreneurship, not just taking the general capitalist like hustle till you die model and overlaying that over our own shit. At the cost of my own mental health and of my children's as their mama. It also looked like deschooling our marriage. Yes.
Each of us took our perception of what happened as what happened, period. I was there, you were there, I saw what happened.
Right. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. We always came to an understanding that went together.
That's the other thing.
And at least we knew where each other stood.
Yeah, well, we got cool.
Seeing what aspects of schoolishness and other types of systemic oppression played themselves out in our relationship and how we deaded them shits. So that's all that came from unschooling. So you got to get you an unschooler's mindset, whether you unschool or not, because that mindset brings in major opportunities for us to kind of lean back and yank our freaking minds and lives away from the ways that we ourselves were socialized and oppressed as young people. We start trusting children more, which is a major collective liberation move. Because through that trust work, we orient our habits and our thoughts to the decolonizing of learning and make learning and ourselves far less susceptible to biases that degrade it from learning to like straight up propaganda. And we remind the world how to stop seeing learning as separate from living. And we encourage the questioning of things. And these are the pistons that fire the liberation engine. These practices, the decision to be far more mindful and connective and partnership centered about where your power lies among generations. This is part of how we reimagine learning and everything. It's in these moments of facing ourselves through our relationships with children where we learn how to be witnesses as children develop instead of trainers who try to steer them down a particular road based on fear and social pressure and capitalism and all of the marketing around that. So get you a mindset shift that embraces the belief that unlike the nanny goat, wasui is actually right for us and actually right for nurturing confident autonomy in ourselves and the people over whom we have power, and resisting the societal norms of schoolishness in all its forms in and outside classrooms. So while I am no longer an unschooling organizer, I will always be grateful for the cultivation of my unschoolers' mindset. That mindset is how my partner and I are learning to protect our daughters from our own baggage and from the acquiescence that we adopted as we made our way into adulthood as best we could. But be clear, we are not protecting our children or any children from the world. We can't. What we're doing is backing up and nurturing partnership, moving away from the colonization that informed how we were parented. so that our children know how to move more comfortably as themselves in the world. And part of how we do this is through open dialogue, together in person, with other people online, in community in various forms, right here upon YouTube. Open dialogue that includes at times our children and our elders about things like, for example, the way we ourselves don't always feel free and how hard it can be to offer something or practice something that you don't really have a lot of experience relating to. Because even though many of us are physically free, freedom looks and feels like different things, right? There's a mental component as well, which is why the mindset is so important to cultivate, to be in community and conversation and content intake around the direction you want to go in, not just more of what you're seeing and not being able to grow from. And when we're willing to work through our own tangles like that, our own relationship to freedom and to liberation, we get to see more clearly the ways that we want to grow and need to grow. We get to name and face and unpack and maybe even understand the challenges that come with being far more familiar with oppression and coercion than we are with trusting and allowing. And that mindset, that practice for us was about answering a very painful question, which was how to raise free people without forcing them to fit into our ideas of free. As Black people, as Caribbean people, we have very particular ideas of freedom, and we learned that our daughters don't always share those perspectives. That made it really difficult to embrace this idea of raising a free person without overlaying my ideas and their dad, Chris's ideas of what I mean. And when you embrace a mindset that allows you to invite and work questions like that, you get access. You start to see more clearly, we start to see more clearly the ways that we participate in our own oppression. And we get better and better at backing up and not plopping those same oppressions down in front of other people's paths, other adults and children who we keep holding responsible for our sense of accomplishment or joy or validation. Get you a mindset that invokes and honors both the history of and your unique ways of developing language and practice for liberation. You do that through inquiry around liberation, inquiry based on your own history and patterns and ideas about freedom, inquiry in community, mad question asking with folks who speak and live in ways that feel aspirational to you, inquiry in community in the form of listening to constructive feedback about how your habits and patterns might be getting in the way of someone else's right to freedom and to joy, so that we can evolve ourselves together and in our own psyches and hearts, and to be able to do that beyond what we've been socialized and groomed to be through standardization, respectability politics, colonization, and rampant and varied systemic oppression. With this level of commitment to deeper inquiry, better listening, which is tied to accountability, and personal leadership, we can begin to see so much more clearly the ways that we can stop contributing to the systemic issues and start being part of the equity and social justice we know can benefit families, communities, cities, countries, and that cannot exclude children. What does your freedom walk look like? And what does your collective liberation journey either already entail or need to entail? Like, I for real want to know. So thanks for watching, and make sure you subscribe so that you do not miss when I get down like this.